We serial killers are your sons, we are your husbands, we are everywhere, and there will be more of your children dead tomorrow. The words are a chilling whisper from the abyss, a declaration of war from the shadows. They were spoken by a man who, on the surface, was the antithesis of a monster. He was handsome, intelligent, charismatic, a law student with a promising political future. But beneath the polished veneer lurked a predator of unparalleled cunning and cruelty. This is inside a killer's mind. And in this series, we will peel back the mask of sanity to stare into the void. This is the story of Theodore Robert Bundy. Episode 1: The Architecture of a Monster. To understand the monster, we must first understand the man, or more accurately, the boy. The roots of Ted Bundy's evil were not planted in a vacuum. They were seeded in a fractured childhood, watered by deception, and cultivated in the fertile soil of a deeply damaged psyche. Born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, at a home for unwed mothers in Burlington, Vermont, his very existence began with a secret. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was unmarried, a source of profound shame for her deeply religious parents in the conservative 1940s. To shield the family from scandal, a lie was constructed, a lie that would become the cornerstone of Ted's fractured identity. For the first years of his life, Ted was raised by his grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, who he believed were his parents. His own mother, Louise, played the role of his older sister. Imagine the psychological dissonance of this arrangement. The person who is biologically programmed to be your primary caregiver, your mother, is presented as a sibling. The maternal bond is warped, twisted into something confusing and distant. This foundational deception created a void where a stable sense of self should have been. If your own identity is built on a lie, what is real? What can be trusted? For a developing child, this is catastrophic. It teaches a dangerous lesson: that appearances are more important than truth, and that a carefully constructed facade can hide a shameful reality. This was a lesson Ted Bundy would master. The environment in the Cowell home was far from stable. His grandfather, Samuel Cowell, was by many accounts a tyrannical, violent man. He was known to beat his wife, the family dog, and swing cats by their tails. He was a bigot who ranted against Catholics, Jews, and Democrats. Some biographers suggest that Ted's first exposure to unrestrained rage and the violent domination of the helpless came from watching his own grandfather. It was a terrifying yet powerful model of male behavior. Even as a young child, there were disturbing signs. His Aunt Julia recalled waking up one morning to find herself surrounded by kitchen knives, with 3-year-old Ted standing by her bed, smiling. It was a chilling foreshadowing of the darkness to come, a glimpse of a fascination with power, control, and the instruments of violence. When Ted was 4, his mother moved them to Tacoma, Washington, to escape the oppressive family environment. There, she met and married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, who adopted Ted and gave him the name that would become infamous. But the move and the new name did not erase the foundational damage. The truth of his parentage was still a secret, a festering wound he would occasionally poke at, a source of deep-seated resentment. He despised Johnny Bundy, viewing him as a weak, working-class man who was intellectually inferior. The shame of his birth morphed into a venomous, class-based snobbery. As an adolescent, Ted was shy, awkward, and socially isolated. He was a boy who desperately wanted to belong, but had no idea how. While his peers were navigating the complexities of dating and friendship, Ted was retreating into a dark inner world. He spent hours at the library, consuming true crime magazines and detective stories. But his real obsession, hidden from everyone, was with violent and sadistic pornography. This is a critical piece of the puzzle. For Bundy, these images weren't just titillating, they were instructional. They became the blueprint for the fantasies that were beginning to consume him. Fantasies of power, of domination, of complete and utter control over another human being. He began to practice voyeurism, becoming a peeping Tom, watching women from the shadows. It was the first step in a terrifying escalation, a bridge from fantasy to reality. He was testing the boundaries, getting a taste of the thrill that came from violating another person's privacy, their safety. Outwardly, however, he was building a mask. The Ted Bundy the world would come to know was being carefully constructed. He was intelligent, articulate, and handsome. He learned to mimic the social cues he didn't naturally understand. He got involved in politics, working on Republican campaigns. He enrolled in college, first at the University of Puget Sound, then the University of Washington, studying psychology of all things. He even worked at a suicide crisis hotline, a chilling irony where a man devoid of empathy counseled the desperate and vulnerable. This mask was his greatest weapon. It was a performance designed to disarm, to charm, to gain trust. It allowed him to move through the world undetected, a predator hiding in plain sight. But the mask was just that, a hollow shell. Beneath it, there was no stable identity, no core of empathy or morality. There was only a profound emptiness, a rage born of shame, and a growing insatiable hunger. His childhood had not created a man. It had forged the architecture of a monster. To truly get inside the mind of Ted Bundy, we must move beyond his biography and delve into the twisted corridors of his psychology. What drives a person to commit such unspeakable acts? In Bundy's case, it was a lethal cocktail of personality disorders and deviant fantasies, dominated by two key components: malignant narcissism and an all-consuming need for control. First, let's examine his narcissism. Narcissistic personality disorder is characterized by a grandiose sense of self-importance, a need for excessive admiration, and a lack of empathy for others. For Bundy, this was not just a character flaw, it was his operating system. He genuinely believed he was superior to everyone around him, more intelligent, more sophisticated, more entitled. This manifested in his charming persona, his confidence, his articulate speech, his political ambitions. They were all part of a performance designed to elicit admiration. He saw other people not as individuals with their own lives and feelings, but as props in his own drama or as mirrors meant to reflect his own perceived greatness. When they failed to do so, or when he felt slighted, his narcissistic rage would simmer beneath the surface. A key event that fueled this rage was his relationship with his college girlfriend, Diane Edwards. She was wealthy, sophisticated, and from a respected family, everything Ted aspired to be. When she broke up with him, citing his immaturity and lack of ambition, it was a devastating narcissistic injury. It confirmed his deepest fears of inadequacy, the same fears rooted in his illegitimate birth and working-class upbringing. Years later, after he had reinvented himself as a successful student and budding politician, he rekindled his relationship with her, only to abruptly dump her in the same manner she had once left him. It was an act of cold, calculated revenge, but this wasn't enough. Many profilers believe that his victims Young, attractive college students with long dark hair parted in the middle were surrogates for Diane. He was not just killing women, he was annihilating the source of his ultimate humiliation, over and over again. This brings us to the second and most crucial element of his psychology, the absolute need for control. Bundy's entire life was an effort to control perceptions, to make people see the brilliant, successful man he wanted to be, not the insecure, shame-filled boy he was. His crimes were the ultimate expression of this need. In murder, he found a sphere where he could exert total, godlike power. He didn't just want to kill his victims, he wanted to possess them. This wasn't about sex in the conventional sense. It was about domination. The sexual assault was an act of degradation, of power, of reducing a human being to an object for his use. He often returned to the crime scenes, grooming the bodies of his victims, reliving the moment of absolute control. He took souvenirs, trophies, and in the most gruesome cases, he kept the severed heads of his victims in his apartment. This was the ultimate act of possession, an attempt to stop time, to keep his victims with him forever, forever under his control. This horrifying behavior was fueled by fantasy. Bundy himself admitted that his actions were driven by what he called the entity, a dark force within him. But this entity was not a separate personality. It was the manifestation of decades of violent, sadistic fantasy nurtured by pornography and his own dark imagination. Before he ever killed, he committed countless murders in his mind. He rehearsed every detail, from the abduction to the final act. This fantasy life became more real and more compelling than his actual life. But fantasy alone eventually becomes insufficient. The urge to translate the thought into deed becomes overwhelming. This is the process of escalation. It started with voyeurism. Then it escalated to breaking and entering, not to steal valuables, but to feel the thrill of being in a woman's private space. Then came the first abductions and murders. With each crime, the high of the act was followed by a period of cooling off, but the hunger always returned, stronger each time. It's the classic addictive cycle. The fantasy demanded to be fed, and with each feeding, the monster grew. By the mid-1970s, Ted Bundy was a prolific hunter, and his methods were so chillingly effective that they would help define a new field of criminology. He became the archetypal subject for the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit and their concept of the organized offender. FBI profilers like John Douglas and Robert Ressler developed a dichotomy to categorize violent criminals, organized and disorganized. A disorganized killer is typically of low intelligence, socially inept, and their crimes are chaotic and spontaneous. The crime scene is messy, the murder weapon is often left behind, and the attack happens in a blitz-style assault. Ted Bundy was the polar opposite. He was the textbook organized offender. These individuals are highly intelligent, socially competent, and meticulous planners. They have jobs, families, and appear to be upstanding members of the community. The mask of sanity is fully intact. Let's look at how Bundy fits this profile perfectly. First, intelligence and planning. Bundy didn't kill randomly. He stalked his victims, learned their routines, and chose the time and place of abduction with care. He used his intelligence to create brilliant and disarming ruses. His most famous was feigning injury. He would put his arm in a sling or use crutches, appearing vulnerable and non-threatening. He would ask a young woman for help carrying books to his car, a Volkswagen Beetle. This ploy was psychologically masterful. It exploited the natural human instinct to help someone in need, turning empathy into a weapon against his victims. Another ruse was impersonating a police officer or firefighter, using a badge to create an aura of authority and demand compliance. Second, the organized offender maintains control over the crime scene. Bundy's vehicle was his primary tool. The passenger seat of his VW had been removed, creating a space to hide an incapacitated victim. His murder kit contained items like a crowbar, handcuffs, rope, and masks. He would abduct his victim from one location, transport them to a secondary, more secluded site to commit the assault and murder, and then dispose of the body in a third location, often hundreds of miles away. This geographical dispersal of evidence made connecting the crimes incredibly difficult for law enforcement, especially in the pre-DNA, pre-computer era of the 1970s. He was a ghost, moving across state lines, leaving a trail of baffled police departments in his wake. Third, the organized offender often follows their own case in the media. Bundy was obsessed with his own notoriety. He meticulously read newspaper articles about the disappearances and murders. This served a dual purpose. On a practical level, it allowed him to gauge how much the police knew and whether they were closing in on him. But on a psychological level, it fed his narcissism. The media attention was a form of recognition, proof of his cleverness and power. He was an invisible celebrity, famous for crimes no one could pin on him. Bundy's profile was so perfectly organized that he became the model that the FBI used to hunt for others like him. He demonstrated that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones who look monstrous. They are the ones who look just like us. They are your neighbors, your colleagues, your sons, your husbands. The hunt for Ted Bundy eventually came to an end. But his capture was not the end of the performance. It was merely a change of stage. The courtroom and the television studio became his new theaters of operation, and he reveled in the spotlight. His behavior during his trials and in his media interviews provides one of the most chilling and revealing windows into his mind. During his 1979 Florida trial for the murders of two Chi Omega sorority sisters, Bundy, a law school dropout, made a stunning decision. He would assist in his own defense. In reality, he often took over, sidelining his experienced defense attorneys. This was not a savvy legal strategy. It was a pure, unadulterated act of narcissism and a desperate bid for control. The courtroom was no longer a place of justice. It was his stage. He cross-examined witnesses, raised objections, and addressed the jury directly. He was charming, articulate, and utterly captivating. For the millions watching the first-ever nationally televised trial, it was a horrifying spectacle. How could this handsome, intelligent man be responsible for such savage crimes? He was banking on that very question. He was trying to manipulate the jury and the public, just as he had manipulated his victims. His need for control extended to every facet of the trial. In a bizarre and infamous moment, he proposed to his former girlfriend, Carol Ann Boone, while she was on the witness stand. By exploiting a quirk in Florida law, their declaration of love in front of a judge constituted a legal marriage. Even as his life hung in the balance, Bundy was orchestrating a soap opera, a spectacle to prove that he was still in charge, still desirable, still able to control the narrative. But it was his interactions with the media, particularly his death row interviews, that offered the most terrifying look into his psyche. He agreed to speak with authors Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth, but he refused to confess. Instead, he devised a disturbing psychological game. He would speak about the crimes, but only in the third person. He theorized about the individual who committed these murders. He offered his expert opinion as a former psychology student, analyzing the killer's motivations, fantasies, and methods with a chilling, detached precision. He described in graphic detail how this person would stalk his victims, what he felt during the act, and how he disposed of the bodies. This third-person confession was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. It allowed him to do two things simultaneously. First, it created a distance, a way to avoid taking direct responsibility. It wasn't, "I did this," but someone like this would do this. Second, and more importantly, it allowed him to relive his crimes, to talk about them, to savor the memories of power and control, all under the guise of academic speculation. He was boasting, showing off his work to an audience, turning his murders into a subject for intellectual analysis. Finally, in the last days before his execution, the mask slipped entirely. In a desperate last-ditch interview with religious broadcaster Dr. James Dobson, Bundy dropped the third-person pretense. He blamed his actions on a lifelong addiction to violent pornography, a claim many profilers see as a convenient, albeit partially true, excuse. He wept. He appeared remorseful. But for those who had studied him for years, it was just one final performance, one last attempt to control the narrative and cast himself as a victim of forces beyond his control. It was a performance that convinced few. The performer had finally run out of stages. Ted Bundy was not an anomaly, but rather a terrifying archetype. To understand his place in the dark pantheon of serial killers, it is helpful to compare him to others who came after. His case provides a blueprint, a reference point for the study of psychopathy. Consider Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, who murdered at least 49 women in Washington state, the very state where Bundy began his killing spree. Like Bundy, Ridgway targeted vulnerable women. But where Bundy was the organized, charismatic hunter, Ridgway was more disorganized. His motives were simpler, less psychologically complex. He lacked Bundy's intelligence and social charm. Ridgway was a predator of opportunity, while Bundy was a predator of design. Or consider Dennis Rader, the BTK killer who terrorized Wichita, Kansas. Rader, like Bundy, was a meticulous, organized killer who lived a double life. He was a church council president and a Boy Scout leader. He also craved public recognition, sending taunting letters to the police and media, giving himself the moniker bind, torture, kill. Both men were driven by fantasy and a need for control. The key difference was in their public persona. Rader was seen as a nerdy, officious bureaucrat. Bundy, on the other hand, projected an image of cool confidence and sophistication. He represented a more terrifying idea, that the monster could be the man everyone admired. This leads us to a fundamental and deeply unsettling question. Was Ted Bundy a monster, or was he a man? The easy answer is to label him a monster, to cast him out from the human race as something wholly other. It's comforting to believe that such evil is a freak of nature, something that could never exist within the spectrum of normal humanity. But the truth, as explored by the philosopher Hannah Arendt in her concept of the banality of evil, is far more disturbing. The most horrific acts in history are not always committed by raving fanatics, but by seemingly ordinary people. Bundy was not born a monster. He was a human being whose capacity for empathy and morality was eroded and ultimately extinguished by a perfect storm of psychological damage, narcissistic rage, and unchecked, violent fantasy. The truly terrifying thing about Ted Bundy is not that he was inhuman. It is that he was so chillingly, convincingly human. His case forces us to confront the reality that the line between good and evil is permeable, and that the capacity for great darkness can reside behind the most ordinary of faces. He shattered the illusion that we can spot evil from a distance. He taught us that it can be charming, intelligent, and sitting right next to us. In this episode, we have journeyed into the formative years and the psychological architecture of Ted Bundy. We have seen how a foundation of lies, shame, and resentment created a void where a soul should have been. We have analyzed the core drivers of his psyche: narcissism, fantasy, and an insatiable need for control. We have seen how he became the textbook organized offender, a master of manipulation and deception, both in his crimes and in the courtroom. But understanding the mind of the killer is only half the story. The other half belongs to the victims he silenced and the investigators who hunted him. Join us next time on Inside a Killer's Mind, as we trace Bundy's bloody timeline of terror across America. We will follow the desperate search for a phantom who left no clues, and we will honor the names and stories of the women whose lives he stole, ensuring they are remembered as more than just footnotes in the biography of a monster.